Well, welcome everybody to GeoHug, and it is going to be such a good one today. I am thrilled that we have Anett Weisheit with us today. So Anett has lived and worked in Alice Springs for over 11 years, and as a field geologist with the Northern Territory Geological Survey, she's had many opportunities to apply her skills as a structural geologist to exciting geological puzzles. From Paleo-Proterozoic shoe zones to Paleozoic fold and thrust belts. So with her expertise, I cannot wait for her to show us the power of observational field geology and applied structural geology. So this is going to be a fantastic session. I hope you all enjoy it. Please use the chat. We'll be opening up the floor at the end for questions. But yes, thank you so much, Anett, for joining. It's awesome having you here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. I think it will be quite exciting.
Very exciting. We've had a lot of interest coming in for this one, so it's going to be good. I was curious what got you into geology to begin with.
Oh, well, I guess that's a rather boring story, actually. Like, so sort of typical German, if you like. When I finished my school, I went to a place where you can, say, type in all your ideas of what you like, what you want to do in future, what your interests are, and a really old computer system then put out a sheet of paper for me with what I could be doing in
Yeah,
future with my interests, and geology was one of them. So I kept on looking into that and said, okay, right, well, let's try geology. And
that is
then I
awesome.
ended up in studying it in Tübingen.
That is really cool. What other things did it suggest for you?
Or there were things like geography, even forestry,
Oh,
or yeah, land management in general.
yeah. Ah,
Yeah, so obviously an outdoor person.
yes, I love that. And
Mm.
what are some career highlights from Germany to Alice Springs? I'm sure you've seen some, yeah, very interesting parts of the earth. I'm curious what some highlights are for you so far.
Oh yeah, well that's the highlight, I guess, being a geologist and being able to go through various places and think about the rocks and identify the background to the
Yeah.
development of those. So we have done field work in the Alps or along the Mediterranean, uh, and these rocks in Europe are very different, of course, to what I have experienced here in Australia. And
Yeah.
then in Australia you get Paleoproterozoic rocks overlain by Neoproterozoic rocks, and these are ages that can only be dreamed of in Europe. Uh, and yeah, I mean, the variety of geology here in Central Australia is quite astounding. So I really enjoyed that part of my work.
That is awesome. What an adventure you've been on so far. It's so good. I'm curious what pet rocks you've collected over your travels. What have you brought along for us today?
So I didn't bring anything from Germany because that is, as you say, quite a long time ago, 11 years. But I have two rocks that I collected here in Central Australia. And one is not structural rock, but very interesting anyway. So you see here on top,
Yeah.
this area, that's a sandstone. And the base of that piece of rock is a granite or a gneiss. And this line here, when I put my finger on it, I have my finger on a 1 billion year old unconformity. So the time break between those two rocks is about 1 billion years.
Wow. That's so cool. My
Yeah,
goodness.
that's just amazing. And the exciting thing about that one was it was not just a small outcrop, but a large pavement. So we could actually sit on that unconformity where about 800, 900 million years ago, the sediments were deposited on top of that gneiss. So
Wow.
we sat on it.
Oh my gosh.
That
That
was
is
exciting.
amazing. Oh my goodness. That is very cool. Well, thank you so much again for joining us today. I'm yeah, very thrilled to have you here. If you want to share your screen and we can get stuck into it.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. And thank you, Jess, for inviting me to give a presentation in this forum. It's really an amazing initiative. And I have to say I'm quite honored to be invited to be part of this project of GeoHug. So yeah, today I'm going to show you lots of field photographs because, well, of course, everyone likes photos. And I want to tell you a story how field observations combined with some of the applied structural geology can help you find hopefully relevant questions and also develop the right answers. So let's see if I can have a laser pointer. Yeah, here we go. Right, so two of my examples that I will be showing today come from my work with the Northern Territory Geological Survey. And I would really like to thank and acknowledge all of my colleagues that work here. We are split in the teams in Darwin and Alice Springs, and their contribution is varied and really widespread around various topics. And all of that has helped me, of course, put together all the information that I will show you today. But I would really like to dedicate this talk to my lecturer and friend Horst Peter Hahn from the University of Tübingen. He is my very first mapping instructor, and now he's retired. But during quite a memorable field trip in the Mediterranean, he told me that in the field, you never should map rocks from a distance. And this has held true throughout my mapping career, really. So you can imagine that it is quite easy to say at a glance, look at a rock from the distance and say, well, this is a marble layer in mica schist, right? Or down there, just another pegmatite budong in a meta mudstone. But the real field observations, I guess, are done really only at a distance of, in my case, 1.70 meters, yeah, or as close as the hand lens allows you. So you can actually see the details in the rocks. So today I will go through 6 topics with a little bit of an introduction, what I mean by questions to answers. Then I have 4 case studies for you, 2 from my work at a geological survey and 2 from my master's and PhD studies at the University of Tübingen in Southwest Germany. And then wrapping it up with a bit of an outline how this might or might not be related to sustainability and adaptive management. All right, let's get started. Good. So yeah, going from questions to answers. Now, this path will probably unlikely be a straight line as shown in this image. It's more likely to be a circle like this. So you start by asking your questions. You collect, say from literature review, yeah, you collect your observational data in the field. Then you apply some structural geology if you can. And with that application, of course, you start to see new questions and need to develop new or find new observations in the field. So you go through this loop over and over again until hopefully by the end you develop your right answers. That's in theory. So a colleague of mine, Nigel Donnellan, when I started putting my talk together, he said, oh, I have something for you. He pointed me to this publication that was published in the GSA Today magazine in May 2020. And in there, Professor Curtis Burmeister from the University of the Pacific in California said, few applications of the scientific method are as pure as geologic mapping. Always have more than one working hypothesis. Keeping observations separate from interpretations will help ensure that the relationships you observe guide your mapping and not the other way around. And this is really important because many processes can lead to the same geological features observed in the field. And that's a phenomenon that has been described as convergent evolution in geology. And as it happens, that is also an interest of my mentor, Horst Hahn. So what it means, in theory, yeah, if you have your observational field geology in the field, you go up that spiral. You increase your number of observations of field relationships, and on the other hand, you decrease your number of working hypotheses or models, and hopefully in the end you come up with a single answer. But because of this thing of convergent evolution, and also because there's not everywhere outcrop, or you might not have time to look at all the outcrop, you end up with a limited amount of observations in the field, and therefore quite a high number of working hypotheses. And this is when hopefully you can get a bit of applied structural geology attached to your data and decrease the number of hypotheses. Right, well, let's get stuck into it and start with beautiful Cap de Creus in northeastern Spain. This is very famous for its structural geology, very well exposed structural geology. So another mentor of mine, my supervisor, PhD supervisor and master's, Professor Paul Bones from the University of Tübingen, he also is very meticulous in collecting field site data, and he showed me how Cap de Creus can provide you with a lot of detail in terms of structural geology. So Cap de Creus is a peninsula at the very eastern end of the actual zone of the Pyrenees in northeastern Spain. And structurally, we know that it was affected by a main deformation event that caused a foliation parallel to the bedding, and we called it S01. It was later then overprinted by asymmetric folds and a second foliation, S2, and again later very narrow shear zones during the D3 event. And they are here marked in this lower right map as the black lines and so on. So it's a bit of an anastomosing shear fabric. So that is basically collecting our information, background information from the literature review. And let's see how that looks in the field. So sure enough, when we go into the field, we see SCO1 being folded into asymmetric folds. Here in this case, a quartzite bed within the metasedimentary succession. We also see that SCO1 is sheared dextrally into moderately sized shear zones, S3. Within the shear zones, we get block boudinage. We might see even sheaf folds of quartz veins and boudinage of pegmatites. So far so good, it looks quite all right. But we keep on collecting data in the field, and the more we collect, the more questions arise. And there's an interesting observation down there in the valley. Yeah, if you start looking a bit closer, you see that SCO1 is actually not wrapping around this presumably pegmatite boudin, but is cross-cutting it. And sometimes SCO1 is even cross-cutting these pegmatitic structures in a high angle that look like boudinage. In another area, you might find that a quartzite layer that was folded previously is now more like straight, but a narrower layer next to it is still folded in a strange pattern. So it just doesn't look quite right. So you keep on finding these evidences in the field, and you start on asking your questions, developing some models on the computer, and come up with a solution. In this case, that was published in 2004 in the Journal of Structural Geology, and talked about pseudo-boudinage in pegmatites. It was the one observation where we see that SCO1 is cross-cutting these boudins in very strange angles. And therefore, in various places, the relationship changes according to the location to the shear zones. And the idea was that these pegmatite podongs are indeed not podongs, but pseudopodongs, and have formed due to inflation and collapse of the diatic acid in place, rather than layer parallel stretching. And the other observation was then later published in Geology in 2013, where we see that beds that have been folded previously in a shear zone can actually unfold again as the shear zone keeps on stretching. So the high strain zones sees those layers being unfolded. And these are things we could observe in the field step by step as we approach the high strain zones. Okay, moving on to case study number 2, we go to Central Australia. Again, we will be looking at a high strain zone. So the Illawarra province is in the heart of Australia, just north of Alice Springs, which is about here where my pointer is. The Illawarra province is exposed Paleoproterozoic rocks, here shown in gray, and it is crisscrossed by an anastomosing network of steeply south and north dipping shear zones, here shown in black, and we will be looking at the Delny shear zone, which is the green outline. The Delny is also bounding Neoproterozoic to Carboniferous high-grade rocks of the Erindina province in the north. So zooming into the study area, outcrop is quite decent. There's a lot of outcrop in this area, especially along the Delny shear zone. So we could find that mylonites and ultramylonitic rocks outcrop in an area as long as 80 kilometers and might be as wide as 4 kilometers. And we find they occur in various rock types, and they can be S tectonites to L tectonites, and variably folded as well. So we collect our data in the field about the orientation of those mylonitic rocks and their stretching lineation. And we plot them on stereo plots because it's simply the best way to show structural data. And in this case, we are looking at the central part of the Delny shear zone, and we divide the plots into geographic regions, the western, the eastern, the northern, and the southern area. And it doesn't matter where we are looking along the shear zone, all structures seem to be oriented in the same way. So in the northeastern quadrant, there are the poles to planes of all the mylonitic structures, and the spread of those poles to planes can be explained just by the anastomosing character of the mylonites. And in the southwestern quadrant, we have plotted the plunge of the stretching lineation and fold axes that we measured in the mylonites. And again, the spread across the southwestern quadrant can be explained by just the anastomosing of these systems around more competent blocks of rock. So seeing all that, we can of course ask the question, are all mylonites of the same age? Have they formed during one single deformation event? Because they are all parallel. So let's go back to the field and collect some more outcrop data. So in the western area, we see that the oldest mylonites, they are of medium grade, so amphibolite facies, and they formed during the third deformation event. So we see that a gneissic foliation S2 is being drag folded into narrow shear zones away from the major structures. And as you approach the major structures, you see increasing strain, evidence for strain. So you get asymmetric folding and local shearing. You get pervasive shear folding of your previous gneiss-society. And then in the highest strain zones, you find that the structures are folded and transposed up to the formation of mylonites, ultramylonites that can be 100 meters wide. So the associated stretching lineation is steeply to moderately plunging to the southwest, just as we saw on our stereo plots. We find that folding is asymmetric and it can be tight, like in this top right photograph, or isoclinal here in the lower left photograph. And the associated fold axis is oriented again parallel to the stretching lineation. And we even find the case that the mylonitic foliation itself is folded into asymmetric isoclinal folds, and with a fold axis again parallel to the stretching lineation. So the parallel character of all the lineations indicate that these structures quite likely formed during progressive deformation, during one deformation event, so that is D3. But we do see overprint, especially because these structures form lower grade mylonites. We find that when S3 is folded into kind of asymmetric folds, and a new fabric has formed, that new fabric that is parallel to the fold axial plane is actually biotite muscovite schists or schistose mylonites, and they can be 1 to 10 meters wide. In thin section, we can see that quartz is statically recrystallized. There's brittle deformation in feldspars, and the fabric is defined by the mica schistosity. So all in all, you could interpret that D3 and D4 might have formed during one single deformation event, here where the shear zone, as it is reversely sheared upwards, goes from a deeper part of the crust in high-grade conditions to a lower part of the crust where the conditions are green schist facies. So the question is this an progressive exhumation of a shear zone? Right, so what we found, just to remember, the orientation of all the mylonites and the stretching lineation of D3 are parallel to all the orientation of the D4 mylonites and their stretching lineation. So that could hint we might see a single deformation event. However, in the field, in some areas, we see outcrop like these where we have quartzitic beds that are folded, and they show the third deformation mylonite being folded into a fourth deformation shear zone. And especially on the picture to the right, you find the stretching lineation here on this quartzitic bed is being folded around the fold axis, which is shallowly plunging in this case. So when I put the drawing on top, it's hopefully a bit clearer that S3 mylonites are actually passively folded by these S4 mylonitic schists. And that is one indication that D3 and D4 are not progressive, but are indeed two different deformation events. And there's more, of course, there's always more. The western area shows two other overprinting localized shear zones that we called D5 and D6, and they come in various scales across the mapping area. So we have asymmetric folding and localized shearing during D5, and the same during D6. So all of this evidence from the field put together, we can come up with a general understanding of how this shear zone formed. We know that the subparallel structures we see in this sheared area are actually of different deformation events. It's not all the same, although they are all coplanar. in the stereo plots. What we also found by mapping the outside areas of this shear zone, that rocks that come from these defined domains, in this case the Dibor domain in the north and the Canendo domain in the central part, have actually been dragged into the shear zone and deformed by the shear zone, which is of course not so easy to see because they are all myelonitic and ultramyelonitic structures. So we find the same stratigraphic relationships within the shear zone as we see it outside. So we could publish this information in one of our explanatory notes. But of course, now you want to ask the question, what is actually the age of those structures? When did they form? D3, D4, D5, D6? And well, that is something you can't find out in the field. You actually have to go into the lab and do your petrochronology, uranium-lead analysis on deformed monazite in situ, in the section. That's what we have done. And if you're interested, you can have a look to the geochronology report. And this is where I showed you at the beginning, the tip of the mountain. Of course, my colleague would probably doesn't like that it is just a tip, but it would be much a higher part of the mountain. Anyway, it is after we have collected the field data and interpreted the structural information, we then went and collected the right samples for petrochronology, which then gave us the final solutions to when these structures formed. And it was actually quite surprising. Okay, going from a high-grade system to a brittle system, a bit further south in Central Australia, going to the Amadeus Basin. So this area is just south of Alice Springs, which is about here. And the Amadeus Basin covers an area of about 170,000 square kilometers. It's a bit larger than the United Kingdom. It is part of an even larger basin, the Centralian Super Basin, which is here marked in blue and red. And those sediments were deposited during the Neoproterozoic to Ordovician and cover the development of Rodinia and Gondwana in the southern hemisphere. So we know that the Amadeus Basin was affected by two orogenic events. One is the Ediacaran to Cambrian Peterman orogeny, which was centered in the Musgrave province to the south of the Amadeus Basin. And the other one was the Ordovician Carboniferous Alice Springs orogeny, which was centered to the north. So our question is, what effect did these orogenies have on the basin? And a good place to start is a general overview of the structures in the basin here, published in 1992, the structural map of the basin. And here you see the scale here, 250 kilometers. It's just about a quarter of the basin, so it's a large area to look at. Now, we know that the Peterman orogeny was centered in the southwest and was verging towards the northeast. And later Alice Springs orogeny was verging towards the south. Both orogenies occurred during deposition of sediments in that basin. And they caused various structures. So in the southern part, we get basement chord nappes and duplex structures. And towards more of the southern central part of the basin, folding gets close to tide and it's locally overturned. The northern tectonic margin is again basement chord nappes and thrust sheets. And we have an area in the west where both orogenic events sort of overlap and we get dome and basin type folds. The central part is rather complicated, and that is where I will be chatting to you about. So that's our literature review. Now, what these structures, how could they possibly have formed? So in theory, there are several options how it can happen, and here are just three of them. we get fault propagation folding, duplication, maybe disharmonic folding in the system during the formation of faults. We might get fault band folding, so we get large-scale NEP structures that move a large distance compared to the fault propagation faults. And we know that there are levels in the stratigraphy that are salt-bearing, and that some parts have been affected by halotectonism. So all sorts of complications going on. Now, let's see what we can find in the field when we collect our data in the field. So we find that faults are quite intimately related to folding. For instance, we see slicken sites and conjugate sets. We see flat and ramp structures. We have veining and cataclasites. And most obviously, there's steepening of strata towards faults that may or may not outcrop. And if they outcrop, they can be fractures or mylonites. And all of that is in an area that has previously been interpreted just to have been affected by buccal folding. So no faulting at all, other than in the subsurface, a detachment. These findings, again, have been published in explanatory notes of this area, if you're interested. So let's just have an example fold structure of the central part of the Amadeus Basin. Here is an anticline that is defined by younger rocks, here shown in blue, and they have a core of older rocks shown in green. So the older rocks are deformed by slightly oblique king-style folding, and their age is Neoproterozoic, so they formed before the Peterman orogeny. Those blue rocks here, their style of folding is different. It's concentric and asymmetric, and it is post-Peterman and pre-Alice Springs orogeny. So when we go and plot these data, sure enough, on the stereo plots, this is also reflected. So we have more of the king-style folding tight in the central part of the anticline, and the concentric folding defining the outer part of the anticline. Now you could imagine that this might be related to disharmonic folding, but it can also be related to an unconformity in that area. So where we have actually a break between Peterman orogeny rocks and Alice Springs orogeny rocks, if you like. And yes, here and there in outcrop we can find the unconformity. It's not that well preserved. It's more in the subsurface in seismic lines where you can see it, which I will show you in a minute. But here and there we find an angular unconformity. So the idea is that this anticline was or is a fault propagation fold that started during the Peterman orogeny and folded these green rocks of the Neoproterozoic. Then later we get Alice Springs, pre-Alice Springs Paleozoic rocks deposited on top, and reactivation of that structure during the Alice Springs orogeny, which caused the original fold to tighten, and the overarching fold being just a concentric system. So yeah, we are looking at a fold propagation fold here, and we see changes in fold style and reactivation of folds and folds. Interesting too is that we see in the field thinning and thickening of sedimentary units as we approach these structures, and that can be an indication that we have some depositional deformation. So these are actually growth folds where the fold propagation happened during the deposition of these sediments. And as I said, in seismic line, that is what you can really nicely see here in this example of 150 kilometer long seismic in the central eastern part of the basin. The southern part of the seismic nicely shows the pre-Precambrian rocks, Trinidad that have been folded in fold propagation anticlines and then overlain by younger rocks. To the north, we get the overprint of the Alice Springs orogeny, where both packages are folded, and we also see some areas where previous Peterman orogeny structures are reactivated during the Alice Springs orogeny. And this is made complicated by the occurrence of a lot of salt in the subsurface. We don't really see them in the surface, which helps detach the fold propagation folds. Nonetheless, we know that some of these folds are thick-skinned. They come from structures derived in basement rocks. And again, this finding has been published recently. So if you're interested, you can have a look to those explanatory notes and maps. That's not the end of the Amadeus Basin. There's more to come. We are currently looking to the eastern part of the basin where structural styles are changing. We get more of the nappes and thrust sheets, where large-scale thrusting and back thrusting may have and possibly has occurred, and also where we get interaction between fold propagation faulting and flat end ramp structures. So if you're interested in that, watch the space. There is more publications to come. Okay, and the final case study, that was actually a wish, apparently, that Jess told me about, is that people would like to hear about brachiation. And well, this is a project I have done during my PhD in South Australia, in an area called the Mount Painter Inlier. So in that inlier, there is a hydrothermal megapracture called the Hidden Valley Fracture, and it is huge. But first of all, let's have a look through the inlier. So we are here in an area sort of halfway up South Australia, in the northern Flinders Ranges. The basement inlier we are looking at is about 80 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide, and it forms the core of a regional scale anticline that formed during fold propagation between about 500 and 290 million years ago. It is overlain by Neoproterozoic rocks, and in the bounding shear zone that caused the uplift of this inlier is called a power fold zone, and at that power fold zone is that mega fracture of Hidden Valley. So Hidden Valley is huge. It's really mappable at a map scale, about 10 square kilometers wide. We know that clasts range in size from sub-millimeter, that is at thin section scale, to a maximum of 300 meters. So here this photo to the left, lower left, is showing a mountain that is one single clast in that mega fracture. We also know that lithologies have been mixed thoroughly in that fracture. They come from different levels in the stratigraphy. Some are of basement rocks, and many are of the overlying basin rocks that have been several kilometers apart stratigraphically. So the question has arisen of how did it form? And in literature, it was described as possibly a salt diapir. So one way to find out is to map lots and lots and lots and lots of clasts in various scales. So we did it at thin section scale, at hand sample scale, and up to the map scale. Digitize these clasts and found a relationship between size and area and roundness and all sorts of other statistical relationships. One interesting find is that a matrix is only apparent in thin sections, and it is of talc, biotite, chloride, or clay, and/or clay. If you look in any larger scale, the matrix is actually made up of smaller clasts. So when you plot that data, you see interesting trends. Here's an example where the number of clasts larger than a certain area, here on the y-axis, is plotted against that area on the x-axis. And all of the fractures we have analyzed in that area are plotting on the same trend of a single slope of about 1.01, 1.03 minus. And the amazing realization is that it includes since section scale right up to the map scale. That slope is called a fractal dimension, and in this case it goes over 6 orders of magnitude. And this indicates that only a single process was responsible for the formation of these fractures, and the number, about 1, of this slope is indicative of hydraulic fracturing. So not salt diapurism, but more related to a high volume of water to rock ratio. Now, finding some answers here, but what processes could have formed this huge mega fracture then? So we look at, say here, the schematic example of a fluid conduit, where we see a fluid bed traveling upwards in that conduit through time, by time. And because of that upward traveling, we get further praxiation of the existing clasts or praxiation of the wall rock and lifting of that clast. But as the water bed comes through, the clasts fall down conduit. And that is step by step how it is possible to get such a huge mixing of various lithologies. So if we look at that in a model scale, particularly for the Mount Painter inlier, we know that exhumation of that inlier occurred by about 12 kilometers during a long span of time, either constantly or in pulses. We know that at a level of about 12 kilometers and deeper, we have an area in the crust that causes alteration of the existing host rocks. We know that large areas are altered and biotite has broken down. And that biotite breakdown released water or fluids into the higher levels of the crust. As they traveled upwards, they then concentrated in fluid conduits. And one of the major concentration zones is, of course, along the Paulana fault zone, which bounds the inlier in the east. So the idea is that because these fluids were focused along these major structures, that is where the praxiation happened at a brittle level of the crust, and we call it the hidden valley type praxiation, where we get chaotic praxiation and mixing. And then over time, as this inlier exhumes along that Paulana fault zone, more and more fluid gets released and concentrates in that praxiation zone and brings the rocks with it. So as lower parts of the crust get incorporated into this fracture, we get, of course, a mixture of rocks that come from higher in the crust to lower in the crust, so they are younger towards older rocks. Yeah, so these are my 4 examples. And to wrap it all up, I'd just like to make a little bit of an interesting statement, I guess, about sustainability and adaptive management, which is a little bit of my interest in the last year or two. So what about field geology? When we have done now all of our observations in the field, we saw interesting structures like sheaf folding, areas that might be thrusted. We have possible fold propagation folding, or the disharmonic folding. So you go into the field and you collect all these various informations in a single area, and you ask your questions and wonder how it all fits together. This is really not any different to the approach of sustainability and adaptive management. So you probably know that United Nations have already in the 80s defined what sustainability is for us. It's about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, and crucially, that includes harmonizing environmental protection, social inclusion, and economic growth. So looking at fieldwork, and this is really just a very broad example, there can be many more, by collecting all of our data in the field and making our early assessments, we really minimize the required work for lab and computer analysis. And therefore, we contribute to environmental protection, of course. On another scale, we have the possibility to have direct contact with landholders, with traditional owners, with communities during fieldwork, and therefore contribute to social inclusion. And the third leg is because we have gained a really solid understanding of geological processes during our fieldwork, we of course contribute to sustainable development and economic growth. But as I said, there's much, much more. And fieldwork is associated with and has the requirement to minimize environmental impact and minimize the use of resources. We can identify and protect geoheritage, we can share values, and all that really has a lot to do with adaptive management. So if you go back to our little circle here of asking questions, collecting data, analyzing the data, asking more questions, and in the end developing the right answers, this is really not any different to your classical adaptive management cycle, where you plan your management, you do it, you evaluate your processes, you adjust your management action plans, and eventually you review to maybe come up with a new plan. And this is all about learning by doing, and fieldwork really has the capacity to do co-learning and knowledge sharing. And by nature, it is proactive and adjustable. So these are all highlights of adaptive management. So there you go. That was my little contribution. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming along. Have a wonderful afternoon. And yeah, I'll see you hopefully next week.